Okay, I think we're live. Just gonna wait for people to trickle in. It's probably gonna be a short live stream today, because I'm feeling a little bit under the weather. I noticed this weekend a little bit of sickness, and it's interesting. I think this is the first cold I've gotten in during cold and flu season during the winter. I've gotten a couple of colds since 2020. Surprisingly, after I think I've mentioned this before, I've been I I didn't get a cold or a flu for about 4 years, and then in the middle of 2020, all of a sudden I got one right after the other for some reason, although not the sickness that's so talked about these days. Anyway, I wanted to talk a little bit about what's happening overseas. Not that there's much I could add to the conversation. There are a lot of these channels that are focused solely on war footage and mapping out the various incursions and gains that have been made by Russia, and the tallying up the equipment losses, which are sort of extraordinary at this point. I'm highly skeptical of the reports that are put out by the respective governments, but the the tallies of how much war material has been lost are kind of astonishing. Although, I guess it's not surprising that there have been a lot of losses, since this is the first real war Russia has engaged in since the Second Chechen War. I mean, they annexed parts of Georgia, South Ossetia, and Abkhazia, and they took over Crimea rather bloodlessly. I think there were about 100 people that died in total when they annexed Crimea. But other than that, the only real warfare they've been involved in has been in Syria. And for the most part, that was essentially providing air support when Bashar Assad was on the verge of being basically losing the country to the Sunni rebels. Russia basically provided, they performed a role akin to what they did during the Korean War, where you had North Korean soldiers doing most of the fighting on land, but the pilots were primarily Chinese, and also Russians were manning the MiGs. So that's sort of what they did in Syria. They provided air support, bombing runs, so that Assad could maintain power and push back the advances of the Sunni rebels. But I think they also provided special operations units. So you probably had Spetsnaz and military advisors, technical advisors, but they haven't been in a real war where they have to think about logistics and technical, basically the upkeep of of trucks and other vehicles. It's not just tanks, although you have to maintain those too. Apparently, there are tanks whose treads are just coming apart, and which haven't been maintained. So the first time they see action, they're sort of they're sort of they're failing the test. So I guess it's not surprising when you look at it that way. But it is kind of disturbing how quickly it's escalated. There was a speech by Putin the other day where he described he described an engagement in the Donbass where a lieutenant general essentially became a suicide bomber. He and this is he's Putin is relaying this, but he described him killing himself in the process of attacking this entrenched unit of Ukrainian soldiers. He said they were the Azov battalion, but essentially he described a suicide bomber, a lieutenant general, which is a pretty high-ranking officer in any army. He described a lieutenant general blowing himself up in order to in order to why I don't know what the actual reasoning was. I guess to prevent capture or to repel an attack by these Ukrainian forces. But the fact that we've gone in approximately 2 weeks, and I think this is day 14 since Russia invaded, the fact that we've gone from normal tactical engagements to the level of suicide or human bomb attacks is kind of disturbing. It reminds me a little bit of what happened in Sri Lanka with the LTTE, the Tamil Tigers, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, who had entire units of suicide bombers that would detonate themselves in government airfields. So they would sneak into government military installations that had valuable offensive weaponry and blow themselves up to destroy it. And the fact that we've sort of hit the Sri Lankan or Northern Ireland stage in the conflict in less than 2 weeks doesn't really bode well for de-escalation. I have to be honest there. It doesn't paint a rosy picture of the future, particularly when you look at when you look at how impossible it is to reconcile the two competing demands. From the Ukraine side, it's a demand that Russia withdraw entirely from the territory that it's occupied, including Donetsk and Luhansk, the regions that Russia wants to declare independent from Ukraine, that wants to detach from Ukraine. All of this area they want Russia to remove itself from. And Russia wants those regions, wants Ukraine to guarantee their independence and to demilitarize, which I don't envision happening anytime soon. So that, coupled with these tactics, and I think there have been Ukrainians too who have basically thrown themselves into tank treads, who are doing human wave attacks on Russian tanks, mirroring some of the bonsai charges of the Japanese in World War II. Hi, David. So when you just look at the tactics and the political demands, um, I'm not Team I are in danger right now. So I've been praying for them, praying that the conflict ends relatively quickly. Although I don't see that happening. When you look at the tactics, which are beginning to resemble something you would see in the Middle East, a Middle East insurgency, or Northern Ireland or Sri Lanka, when those were at war. When you look at the tactics from that perspective and irreconcilable demands from each party, I don't really see. I see. I mean, it's been mentioned that the the eventually this will become something closer to Syria, which would be really disturbing. But I don't see that happening either, in the sense of I could see increasing bloodshed, intractable battles, but I don't see it resembling Syria in the sense that if other nations become more deeply enmeshed, where you have other nations from the West bombing and supporting the Ukraine, or Russia expanding into NATO partners, I don't see that happening because it would just initiate a global war, which I don't think, despite some of the propagandizing you see, I don't see that. I mean, Bill Christo might want that, some others, but I don't see that as a viable option at this point. I mean, Turkey and Qatar and the UAE, all of the Middle Eastern nations, NATO, they could all get involved in Syria with relatively, uh, well, I would say the repercussions from their actions wouldn't be that dire. Although there was an incident where the US and Russia came into conflict in Syria, if I recall. They they essentially bombed Russian contractors who were basically former Russian special forces and military. They transferred into being contractors, which is something that occurs in the US and UK and other countries as well. You're much more handsomely compensated in that role. So you see a lot of former servicemen go into military contracting. And I think we killed, or the US government killed, a few hundred of them, if I'm not mistaken. Uh, so and in fact, in 2016, there was Hillary Clinton's demand that we impose a no-fly zone over Syria. And I don't know if you recall the presidential debates, but that was a huge issue issue at the time because it would have brought us into direct conflict with Russia. uh, One of the reasons that the Syrian conflict hasn't expanded is the some sort of mutually agreed upon demarcation lines. So Turkey and Russia, even though they're working at cross purposes, they're backing different sides, they set down certain markers that they won't cross. And countries that are seemingly uh, seemingly hostile when it comes to their interests in Syria. Like Israel and Russia actually provide a little bit of leeway. They are in they have lines of communication open if a bombing or missile attack is going to occur in the vicinity of their area of operations. So a buffer state. Yeah, the actual the thing is, this does extend obviously beyond the past 2 weeks or the past month, even though it's sort of reached a crescendo. Um, it depends on how far back you wanna go. There, the issue of NATO expansion has been there ever since the demise of the Soviet Union. And Pat Buchanan wrote about this in his book, A Republic, Not an Empire, which in some respects it's dated. Obviously, it was published in 1999, I think, a little bit before the turn of the century. So some of the things, are sort of dated and are not applicable. I can't remember them offhand, but there are a few things that obviously issues that were salient 20 something 23 years ago that really aren't that relevant now. But one of the things that is very relevant is his discussion of NATO expansion, and he foresaw the problems at the time. The idea of a weakened Russia dealing with that country at the same time that you had all of these recently liberated countries in Eastern Europe, as well as post-Soviet republics like Ukraine and Kazakhstan, and there are about 15 in total, I think. Um, they comprise the Commonwealth of Independent States. I think those were the initials, but all of these former Soviet republics, a lot of whom had large Russian populations. And speaking of the ones outside of the Ukraine, um, but even in the Ukraine, there were forced deportations of Tartars and population relocations. But beyond that, in other parts of the Soviet Union, that there are large Russian populations that stem solely from Stalinization, the policies that Stalin and his successors pursued. Uh, and that they actually, some of them actually preceded Stalin. Um, and it's interesting, the deportation of Chechens and Ingush began in, I didn't know this until recently. They began on my birthday on February 23rd, back in the 1930s, I believe. Hey, GW. So yeah, like if you want to go back far enough, you could start in 91. Although obviously the Ukraine and Russia, the conflict there stretches back more than a century at this point. There was actually an interesting video that described the conflict between the Ukraine and Russia, um, which is worth watching. Because it's sort of interesting when you look at the Bolshevik Revolution and its aftermath. It's really astounding when you look at all the downstream effects that communism had. The fact that the Bolsheviks were successful rather than defeated. But even if they had been defeated, theoretically, there still would have been problems. I mean, one of the issues that led to the Ukraine succumbing to uh, Russia after the Bolsheviks had taken power was the conflict between the white Russians, the White Army, and Ukrainian nationalists. They at one point, I think the Ukrainian nationalists were fighting, or at least part of their army was fighting the whites, the reds, and I think the Poles, because there was a conflict between there was a war between Poland and Russia after World War I, in which Poland was victorious eventually. But you had them fighting all these sides. So even if the Bolsheviks had been defeated, which I think would have been a much better outcome from a historical point of view, there probably still would have remained this conflict between Russia, which sees the Ukraine as part of Russia as sort of one holistic unit, and Ukraine, which sees itself as a sovereign, independent state. I think uh, reading Putin's speech, but which he delivered before declaring war and invading, is very fascinating. I didn't read the whole speech, but the part where he's describing the Ukraine as an artificial state created by Lenin is very illuminating, because I think it sheds light onto, I wouldn't say the Russia, because I don't want to generalize on what the Russian viewpoint is, but I think it sheds light on a certain perspective, on a certain Russian perspective, which believes that Ukraine is an artificial state, and he attributes it to Leninism. And Steve Saylor had an amusing tweet about this where he compared it to Hannah Nicole Jones, that ridiculous woman behind the 1619 project. So he compared it to her view of why white people should be dispossessed of their inheritance. In other words, like, white people shouldn't be able to inherit anything. It should be given as reparations to African American people. And it was it was sort of a great analogy. I mean, it was a little glib, but I think I think it was very it was a salient point. This idea that because the Ukraine or Ukraine is because it was incorporated as a republic, a Soviet socialist republic under duress, mind you. This wasn't really the Ukrainians' choice, but Lenin brought into the as one of the founding republics in the USSR. Because of that, that means that Ukraine is not an actual national entity. Um, and it's a weird flex, to be honest. when you when you look at it, it's kind of like saying that Ireland, and this analogy is a bit strained, but it's sort of like saying Ireland is not a nation, or wasn't a nation until the Anglo-Irish Treaty, established what became the Irish Republic ultimately, after De Valera split completely from the UK, but it was still part um, of the crown at the time. So it would be akin to saying, like, Ireland is not a country because it was established, quote unquote, by Great Britain or the United Kingdom, or Kurds are not a real people, or weren't a real people until Rojava came into being during the Syrian civil war. Um, when China took Tibet. That's interesting. China, um, I think this was, I forget if it was 56 or 50. It I think they actually, China took over Tibet. I think I could be wrong about this, but I think it was around the time that Hungary rose up against the Soviet Union, which again, I could be completely wrong by this, but I think it was around. I don't know if it was the same year, but it was around that time, which lends credence to the idea that China might try to, depending on how successful Russia is s- um, at annexing or di- uh, dismembering, whatever the plan is for Ukraine, depending on how successful they are at implementing that, you might see China try to do that with Taiwan. Although there are people who say that's probably not the case because they don't want to upset the apple cart, notwithstanding all the bellicose language, which is sort of a given for the CCP. They don't want to disrupt. It'll be very disruptive for well, for one thing, for the Chinese economy. So there are competing views about that. But I think that was when, someone can post in the comments if I'm wrong about this. I think China invaded Tibet around that time, and it's interesting. I don't know. I don't know if there was an uproar comparable to this. I don't think so, and I think one of the reasons may have been because there was not much the world could do about Tibet. I know there were CIA. I think there were CIA officers there. There was some sort of attempt to recapture Tibet, and I know one of the recurring themes of the anti-communist bloc in the Republican Party was that the U.S. had ceded so much. I mean, this was one of the reasons they hated Eisenhower so much. His relationship with George Marshall, who basically gave up China. I know people consider this as a myth at the time, but if you actually read some of the history behind what happened in the Chinese Civil War and the amount of influence Marshall exerted to basically help, I don't know if I would use the word, well, yeah, basically help Mao trying to, he did have a lot of responsibility for what happened during the Chinese Civil War. Although ultimately, obviously, it was there were a lot of mistakes made by Shang and the Kuomintang. So, hey, oh, thank you, repent. Um, what was I saying? Oh yeah, well, to just going back to I don't know, but yeah, I think there was some pushback, but there really wasn't much that they could do. Although the situation is sort of analogous in the sense that China views Tibet as historically part of China, even though they were at one point an independent kingdom. They consider Tibet part of China in the same way that Russia would consider the Ukraine part of Russia. I mean, even aside from Putin, I think it's not it's not a minority opinion. Again, someone can correct me if I'm wrong about this. Within Russia itself, so I mean, there is sort of a comparison to be made there. Although I think the main reason was there wasn't much the West could do about it at the time. Um, Anyway, like I said, I'm a little bit under the weather, so I'm probably gonna cut this short just under before we get to a half hour. Thanks everyone, David, Repent, Godward, GW.